Public Works Steampunk presents Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte, with steampunk additions by R.A. Harding. Read by Danita Feldman.
Chapter 7, in which Jane endures a visit from Mr. Brocklehurst. My first quarter at Lowood seemed an age, and not the golden age either. It comprised an irksome struggle with difficulties in habituating myself to new rules and unwanted tasks. The fear of failure in these points harassed me worse than the physical hardships of my lot, though these were no trifles. The monsoon season came early, beginning in May and lasting until September. The perpetual rains, and after the flooding went down the almost impassable roads, prevented our stirring beyond the garden walls except to go to puja at the temple. But within these limits we had to pass an hour every day in the open air. Our clothing was insufficient to protect us from the severe damp. We had no boots. The mud got on our sandals and made a perpetual mess. The mosquitoes bit ceaselessly, our uncovered arms and legs covered with bites. I remember well the distracting irritation I endured from this cause every evening when the bites inflamed, and the torture of trying not to scratch or slap constantly at the irritants. Then the scanty supply of food was distressing. With the keen appetites of growing children, we had scarcely sufficient to keep alive a delicate invalid. From this deficiency of nourishment resulted an abuse which pressed hardly on the younger pupils. Whenever the famished great girls had an opportunity, they would coax or menace the little ones out of their portion. Many a time I have shared between two claimants the precious morsel of bread distributed at tea time, and after relinquishing to a third half the contents of my mug of chai, I have swallowed the remainder with an accompaniment of secret tears, forced from me by the exigency of hunger. Sundays were dreary days in that first season. We had to walk 2 miles to the main temple in the area, and spend an hour in prayers and prostrations, and then another mile to Brocklebridge Shrine where our patron officiated. It was the one day we wore a sari instead of the salwar kameez, vests and chunni. I did not know how to wrap a sari, and it took some weeks of Miss Smith and Helen showing me where to tuck all the yards of fabric to make mine orderly. We set out in the wet. We arrived at the temple wet. During the morning service we became most uncomfortable. It was too far to return to dinner, and an allowance of samosas in the same penurious proportion observed in our ordinary meals was served round between the services. At the close of the afternoon service we returned by an exposed and hilly road where the rain and the mud sweeping down from the mountains to the north almost drowned us as we walked. I can remember Miss Mandir walking lightly and rapidly along our drooping line, her blue sari, which the driving rain fluttered, gathered close about her, sheltering as many could fit beneath her umbrella and encouraging us by precept and example to keep up our spirits and march forward, as she said, like stalwart soldiers. The other teachers, poor things, were generally themselves too much dejected to attempt the task of cheering others. How we longed for the light and heat of a blazing fire when we got back. The fire dried out our clothes and provided some relief, but to the little ones at least this was denied. Each hearth in the schoolroom was immediately surrounded by a double row of great girls, and behind them the younger children crouched in groups, wrapping their starved arms in their saris. A little solace came at tea time, in the shape of a double ration of bread, a whole instead of a half slice, with a delicious addition of a thin scrape of butter. It was the weekly treat to which we all looked forward from Sabbath to Sabbath. I generally contrived to reserve a morsel of this bounteous repast for myself, but the remainder I was invariably obliged to part with. The Sunday evening was spent in repeating by heart the church catechism, portions of the Upanishads, and in listening to a long sermon read by Miss Miller, whose irrepressible yawns attested her weariness. A frequent interlude of these performances by some half-dozen of little girls who, overpowered with sleep, would fall down, if not out of the third loft, yet off the fourth form, and be taken up half dead. The remedy was to thrust them forward into the centre of the schoolroom and oblige them to stand there till the sermon was finished. Sometimes their feet failed them, and they sank together in a heap. They were then propped up with the monitor's high stools. I have not yet alluded to the visits of Mr. Brocklehurst, and indeed that gentleman was from home during the greater part of the first month after my arrival, perhaps prolonging his stay with his friend the arch-pundit. His absence was a relief to me. I need not say that I had my own reasons for dreading his coming, but come he did at last. One afternoon, I had then been 3 weeks at Lowood, as I was sitting with a slate in my hand puzzling over a sum in long division, my eyes raised in abstraction to the window, caught sight of a figure just passing. I recognized almost instinctively that gaunt outline, and when 2 minutes after all the school, teachers included, rose en masse, it was not necessary for me to look up in order to ascertain whose entrance they thus greeted. A long stride measured the schoolroom, and presently beside Miss Mandeer, who herself had risen, stood the same black column which had frowned on me so ominously from the hearthrug of Gateshead. I now glanced sideways at this piece of architecture. My hand fluttered to my ocular gears. Yes, I was right. It was Mr. Brocklehurst, buttoned up in a surtout and looking longer, narrower, and more rigid than ever. I had my own reasons for being dismayed at this apparition. Too well I remembered the perfidious hints given by Mrs. Reed about my disposition, the promise pledged by Mr. Brocklehurst to apprise Miss Mandeer and the teachers of my vicious nature. All along I had been dreading the fulfilment of this promise. I had been looking out daily for the coming man, whose information respecting my past life and conversation was to brand me as a bad child for ever. Now there he was. He stood at Miss Mandeer's side. He was speaking low in her ear. I did not doubt he was making disclosures of my villainy, and I watched her eye with painful anxiety, expecting every moment to see its dark orb turn on me a glance of repugnance and contempt. I listened too, and as I happened to be seated quite at the top of the room, I caught most of what he said. Its import relieved me from immediate apprehension. "I suppose, Miss Mandeer, the thread I bought at Jaipur will do. It struck me that it would be just of the quality for the vests, and I sorted the needles to match. You may tell Miss Smith that I forgot to make a memorandum of the darning needles, but she shall have some papers sent in next week, and she is not, on any account, to give out more than one at a time to each pupil. If they have more, they are apt to be careless and lose them. And oh, ma'am, I noted the oil for use on clockwork editions and limbs is lower than I expected it to be. You must not give out so much. Children will complain over the slightest catch or squeak, and they must not be indulged. Also, I wish the white trousers were better looked to. When I was here last, I went into the kitchen garden and examined the clothes drying on the line. There was a quantity of white trousers in a very bad state of repair. From the size of the holes and the mud on the hems in them, I was sure they had not been well mended or cleaned from time to time." He paused. "Your directions shall be attended to, sir," said Miss Mandeer. "And, ma'am," he continued, "the laundress tells me some of the girls have 2 clean sari in the week. It is too much. The rules limit them to 1. "I think I can explain that circumstance, sir. Amara and Chanda Devi were invited to take tea with some friends last Thursday, and I gave them leave to put on clean sari for the occasion." Mr. Brocklehurst nodded. "Well, for once it may pass, but please not to let the circumstance occur too often. And there is another thing which surprised me. I find in settling accounts with the housekeeper that a lunch consisting of roti and cheese has twice been served out to the girls during the past fortnight. How is this? I looked over the regulations and I find no such meal as lunch mentioned. Who Who introduced this innovation, and by what authority?" "I must be responsible for the circumstance, sir," replied Miss Mandeer. "The breakfast was so ill prepared that the pupils could not possibly eat it, and I dared not allow them to remain fasting till dinner time." "Madam, allow me an instant. You are aware that my plan in bringing up these girls is not to accustom them to habits of luxury and indulgence, but to render them hardy, patient, self-denying. Should any little accidental disappointment of the appetite occur, such as the spoiling of a meal, the under or the overdressing of a dish, the incident ought not to be neutralized by replacing with something more delicate the comfort lost, thus pampering the body and obviating the aim of this institution. It ought to be improved to the spiritual edification of the pupils by encouraging them to evince fortitude under temporary privation. A brief address on those occasions would not be mistimed, wherein a judicious instructor would take the opportunity of referring to the sufferings of the early Hindu Christians, to the torments of martyrs, to the exhortations of our blessed Lord's divine consolations. If ye suffer hunger or thirst for my sake, happy are ye. Oh, madam, when you put roti and cheese instead of burnt porridge into these children's mouths, you may indeed feed their vile bodies, but you little think how you starve their immortal souls." Mr. Brocklehurst again paused, perhaps overcome by his feelings. Miss Mandeer had looked down when he first began to speak to her, but she now gazed straight before her, and her face, naturally dark as polished mahogany, appeared to be assuming also the coldness and fixity of that material, especially her mouth, closed as if it would have required a sculptor's chisel to open it, and her brow settled gradually into petrified severity. Meantime, Mr. Brocklehurst, standing on the hearth with his hands behind his back, majestically surveyed the whole school. Suddenly his eye gave a blink, as if it had met something that either dazzled or shocked its pupil. Turning, he said in more rapid accents than he had hitherto used, "Miss Mandeer, Miss Mandeer, what is that girl with curled hair? Red hair, ma'am. Curled all over." And extending his cane, he pointed to the awful object, his hand shaking as he did so. "It is Julia Severn," replied Miss Mandeer very quietly. "Julia Severn, ma'am, and why has she or any other curled hair? Why, in defiance of every precept and principle of this house, does she conform to the world so openly, here, in an evangelical charitable establishment, as to wear her hair one mass of curls?" "Julia's hair curls naturally," returned Miss Mandeer still more quietly. "Naturally, yes, but we are not to conform to nature. I wish these girls to be the children of grace. And why that abundance? I have again and again intimated that I desire the hair to be arranged closely, modestly, plainly. Miss Mandeer, that girl's hair must be cut off entirely. I will send a barber tomorrow, and I see others who have far too much of the excrescence. That tall girl, tell her to turn round. Tell all the first form to rise up and direct their faces to the wall." Miss Mandeer passed her handkerchief over her lips as if to smooth away the involuntary smile that curled them. She gave the order, however, and when the first class could take in what was required of them, they obeyed. Leaning a little back on my bench, I could see the looks and grimaces with which they commented on this manoeuvre. It was a pity Mr. Brocklehurst could not see them too. He would perhaps have felt that, whatever he might do with the outside of the cup and platter, the inside was further beyond his interference than he imagined. He scrutinized the reverse of these living medals some 5 minutes, then pronounced sentence. These words fell like the knell of doom. "All those top knots must be cut off." Miss Mandeer seemed to protest. "Madam," he pursued, "I have masters to serve whose kingdom is not of this world. My mission is to mortify in these girls the lusts of the flesh, to teach them to clothe themselves with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair and costly apparel. And each of the young persons before us has a string of hair twisted in plaits which vanity itself might have woven. These, I repeat, must be cut off. Think of the time wasted, of—" Mr. Brocklehurst was here interrupted. 3 other visitors, ladies, now entered the room. They ought to have come a little sooner to have heard his lecture on dress, for they were splendidly attired in velvet, silk, and furs. The 2 younger of the trio, fine girls of 16 and 17, had grey beaver hats, then in fashion, shaded with ostrich plumes, and from under the brim of this graceful headdress fell a profusion of light tresses, elaborately curled. The elder lady was enveloped in a costly velvet shawl, trimmed with ermine, and she wore a false front of French curls. These ladies were deferentially received by Miss Mandeer as Mrs. and the Misses Brocklehurst, and conducted to seats of honour at the top of the room. It seems they had come in the carriage with their reverend relative, and had been conducting a rummaging scrutiny of the room upstairs, while he transacted business with the housekeeper, questioned the laundress, and lectured the superintendent. They now proceeded to address divers remarks and reproofs to Miss Smith, who was charged with the care of the linen and the inspection of the dormitories, but I had no time to listen to what they said. Other matters called off and enchanted my attention. Hitherto, while gathering up the discourse of Mr. Brocklehurst and Miss Mandeer, I had not, at the same time, neglected precautions to secure my personal safety, which I thought would be effected if I could only elude observation. To this end, I had sat well back on the form, and while seeming to be busy with my sum, had held my slate in such a manner as to conceal my face. I might have escaped notice had not my treacherous slate somehow happened to slip from my hand, and falling with an obtrusive crash, directly drawn every eye upon me. I knew it was all over now, and as I stooped to pick up the 2 fragments of slate, I rallied my forces for the worst. It came. "A careless girl," said Mr. Brocklehurst, and immediately after, "It is the new pupil, I perceive." And before I could draw breath, "I must not forget I have a word to say respecting her." Then aloud, how loud it seemed to me, "Let the child who broke her slate come forward." Of my own accord, I could not have stirred. I was paralysed. But the 2 great girls who sit on each side of me set me on my legs and pushed me towards the dread judge. And then Miss Mandeer gently assisted me to his very feet, and I caught her whispered counsel. "Don't be afraid, Jane. I saw it was an accident. You shall not be punished." The kind whisper went to my heart like a dagger. Another minute, and she will despise me for a hypocrite, thought I, and an impulse of fury against Reed, Brocklehurst and Company bounded in my pulses at the conviction. I was no Helen Burns. "Fetch that stool," said Mr. Brocklehurst, pointing to a very high one from which a monitor had just risen. It was brought. "Place the child upon it." And I was placed there. By whom, I don't know. I was in no condition to note particulars. I was only aware that they had hoisted me up to the height of Mr. Brocklehurst's nose, that he was within a yard of me, and that a spread of shot orange and purple silk pelisses and a cloud of silvery plumage extended and waved below me. Mr. Brocklehurst hemmed. "Ladies," said he, turning to his family, "Miss Mandeer, teachers and children, you all see this little girl." Of course they did, for I felt their eyes directly like burning glasses against my scorched skin. "You see she is yet young. You observe she possesses the ordinary form of childhood, The gods have graciously given her the shape that is given to all of us, though she bears a mechanical deformity which points her out as a marked character. Who would think that evil had already found a servant and agent in her? Yet such, I grieve to say, is the case. A pause in which I began to steady the palsy of my nerves, and that the trial, no longer to be shirked, must be firmly sustained. My dear children, pursued the black marble clergy pundit with pathos, this is a sad, a melancholy occasion, for it becomes my duty to warn you that this girl, who might be one of the gods' own lambs, is a little castaway, not a member of the true flock, but evidently an interloper and an alien. You must be on your guard against her. You must shun her example. If necessary, avoid her company, exclude her from your sports, and shut her out from your converse. Teachers, you must watch her. Keep your eyes on her movements, weigh well her words, scrutinize her actions, punish her body to save her soul, if, indeed, such salvation be possible. For, my tongue falters while I tell it, this girl, this child, the native of a Hindu Christian land, this girl is a liar. Now came a pause of 10 minutes, during which I, by this time in perfect possession of my wits, observed all the female Brocklehursts produce their pocket handkerchiefs and apply them to their optics, while the elderly lady swayed herself to and fro, and the two younger ones whispered, "How shocking!" Mr. Brocklehurst resumed. "This I learned from her benefactress, from the pious and charitable lady who adopted her in her orphan state, reared her as her own daughter, and whose kindness, whose generosity, the unhappy girl repaid by an ingratitude so bad, so dreadful, that at last her excellent patroness was obliged to separate her from her own young ones, fearful lest her vicious example should contaminate their purity. She has sent her here to be healed, and teachers, superintendent, I beg of you not to allow the waters to stagnate round her." With this sublime conclusion, Mr. Brocklehurst adjusted the top button of his overcoat, muttered something to his family, who rose, bowed to Miss Mandeer, and then all the great people sailed in state from the room. Turning at the door, my judge said, "Let her stand half an hour longer on that stool, and let no one speak to her during the remainder of the day." There was I, then, mounted aloft. I who had said I could not bear the shame of standing on my natural feet in the middle of the room, now exposed to general view on a pedestal of infamy. What my sensations were, no language can describe. But just as they all rose, stifling my breath and constricting my throat, a girl came up and passed me. In passing, she lifted her eyes. What a strange light inspired them! What an extraordinary sensation that ray sent through me! How the new feeling bore me up! I mastered the rising hysteria, lifted up my head, and took a firm stand on the stool. Helen Burns asked some slight question about her work of Miss Smith, was chidden for the triviality of the inquiry, returned to her place, and smiled at me as she again went by. What a smile! I remember it now, and I know that it was the effluence of fine intellect, of true courage. It lit up her marked lineaments, her thin face, her sunken grey eye, like a reflection from the aspect of an angel. Yet, at that moment, Helen Burns wore on her arm the untidy badge. Scarcely an hour ago I had heard her condemned by Miss Scatcherd to a dinner of bread and water on the morrow because she had blotted an exercise in copying it out. Such is the imperfect nature of man. Such spots are there on the disk of the clearest planet. and eyes like Miss Scatcherd's can only see those minute defects and are blind to the full brightness of the orb. Chapter 8, in which Jane finds her place at Lowood. Ere the half-hour ended, 5 o'clock struck, school was dismissed, and all were gone into the refectory to tea. I now ventured to descend. It was deep dusk. I retired into a corner and sat down on the floor. The spell by which I had been so far supported began to dissolve. Reaction took place. And soon, so overwhelming was the grief that seized me, I sank prostrate with my face to the ground. Now I wept. Helen Burns was not here. Nothing sustained me. Left to myself, I abandoned myself, and my tears watered the boards. I had meant to be so good, and to do so much at Lowood, to make so many friends, to earn respect and win affection. Already I had made visible progress. That very morning I had reached the head of my class. Miss Miller had praised me warmly. Miss Mandia had smiled approbation. She had promised to teach me drawing, and to let me learn French and Hindi if I continued to make similar improvement 2 months longer. And then I was well received by my fellow pupils, treated as an equal by those of my own age, and not molested by any. Now here I lay, again crushed and trodden on, and could I ever rise more? Never, I thought, and ardently I wished to die. While sobbing out this wish in broken accents, someone approached. I started up. Again, Helen Burns was near me. The fading fires just showed her coming up the long vacant room. She brought my chai and roti. "Come, eat something," she said, but I put both away from me, feeling as if a drop or a crumb would have choked me in my present condition. Helen regarded me, probably with surprise. I could not now abate my agitation. Though I tried hard, I continued to weep aloud. She sat down on the ground near me, embraced her knees with her arms and rested her head upon them. In that attitude she remained silent as an Indian. I was the first who spoke. "Helen, why do you stay with a girl whom everybody believes to be a liar?" "Everybody, Jane? Why, there are only 80 people who have heard you called so, and the world contains hundreds of millions." "But what have I to do with millions? The 80 I know despise me." "Jane, you are mistaken. Probably not one in the school either despises or dislikes you. Many, I am sure, pity you much." "How can they pity me after what Mr. Brocklehurst has said?" "Mr. Brocklehurst is not a god, nor is he even a great and admired man. He is little liked here. He never took steps to make himself liked. Had he treated you as an especial favourite, you would have found enemies, declared or covert, all round you. As it is, the greater number would offer you sympathy if they dared. Teachers and pupils may look coldly on you for a day or two, but friendly feelings are concealed in their hearts. And if you persevere in doing well, these feelings will ere long appear so much the more evidently for their temporary suppression. Besides, Jane—" She paused. "Well, Helen," said I, putting my hand into hers. She chafed my fingers gently to warm them, and went on. "If all the world hated you and believed you wicked, while your own conscience approved you and absolved you from guilt, you would not be without friends. No, I know I should think well of myself, but that is not enough. If others don't love me, I would rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated, Helen. Look here, to gain some real affection from you or Miss Mandia or any other whom I truly love, I would willingly submit to have the bone of my arm broken, or to let a bull toss me, or to stand behind a kicking horse and let it dash its hoof at my chest." "Hush, Jane. You think too much of the love of human beings. You are too impulsive, too vehement. The sovereign hands that created your frame and put life into it has provided you with other resources than your feeble self, or than creatures feeble as you. Besides this earth and besides the race of men, there is an invisible world and a kingdom of spirits. That world is around us, for it is everywhere, and those spirits watch us, for they are commissioned to guard us, and if we were dying in pain and shame, if scorn smote us on all sides and hatred crushed us, angels see our tortures, recognize our innocence, if innocent we be, as I know you are of this charge which Mr. Brocklehurst has weakly and pompously repeated at second hand from Mrs. Reed. For I read a sincere nature in your ardent eyes and on your clear front, and the gods wait only the separation of spirit from flesh to crown us with a full reward. Why, then, should we ever sink overwhelmed with distress, when life is so soon over, and death is so certain an entrance to happiness, to glory? I was silent. Helen had calmed me, but in the tranquillity she imparted there was an alloy of inexpressible sadness. I felt the impression of woe as she spoke, but I could not tell whence it came, and when, having done speaking, she breathed a little fast and coughed a short cough, I momentarily forgot my own sorrows to yield to a vague concern for her. Resting my head on Helen's shoulder, I put my arms round her waist. She drew me to her, and we reposed in silence. The whisper of my clockwork clicked against her thin cheek, her flesh cool and her breath rasping. We had not sat long thus, when another person came in. Some heavy clouds, swept from the sky by a rising wind, had left the moon bare, and her light, streaming in through a window near, shone full both on us and on the approaching figure, which we at once recognized as Miss Mandeer. "I came on purpose to find you, Jane Eyre," said she. "I want you in my room, and as Helen Burns is with you, she may come too." We went, following the superintendent's guidance. We had to thread some intricate passages, past windows where the rain poured in the darkness, and mount a staircase before we reached her apartment. It contained a good fire and looked cheerful. Miss Mandeer told Helen Burns to be seated in a low armchair on one side of the hearth, and herself taking another, she called me to her side. "Is it all over?" she asked, looking down at my face. "Have you cried your grief away?" "I'm afraid I never shall do that." "Why?" "Because I have been wrongly accused, and you, ma'am, and everybody else will now think me wicked." "We shall think you what you prove yourself to be, my child. Continue to act as a good girl, and you will satisfy us." "Shall I, Miss Mandeer?" "You will," said she, passing her arm round me. "And now tell me, who is the lady whom Mr. Brocklehurst called your benefactress?" "Mrs. Reed, my uncle's wife. My uncle is dead, and he left me to her care." "Did she not, then, adopt you of her own accord?" "No, ma'am. She was sorry to have to do it, but my uncle, as I have often heard the servants say, got her to promise before he died that she would always keep me." "Well now, Jane, you know, or at least I will tell you, that when a criminal is accused he is always allowed to speak in his own defence. You have been charged with falsehood. Defend yourself to me as well as you can. Say whatever your memory suggests is true, but add nothing and exaggerate nothing." I resolved in the depth of my heart that I would be most moderate, most correct, and having reflected a few minutes in order to arrange coherently what I had to say, I told her all the story of my sad childhood. Exhausted by emotion, my language was more subdued than it generally was when it developed that sad theme, and mindful of Helen's warnings against the indulgence of resentment, I infused into the narrative far less of gall and wormwood than ordinary. Thus restrained and simplified, it sounded more credible. I felt, as I went on, that Miss Mandeer believed me. In the course of the tale I had mentioned Mr. Lloyd as having come to see me after the fit, for I never forgot the, to me, frightful episode of the Red Room, in detailing which my excitement was sure in some degree to break bounds, for nothing could soften in my recollection the spasm of agony which clutched my heart when Mrs. Reed spurned my wild supplication for pardon and locked me a second time in the dark and haunted chamber. I had finished. Miss Mandeer regarded me a few minutes in silence. Then she said, "I shall write to the keepers of this automaton apothecary, Mr. Lloyd. If their reply agrees with your statement, you shall be publicly cleared from every imputation. To me, Jane, you are clear now." She kissed me, and still keeping me at her side, where I was well contented to stand, for I derived a child's pleasure from the contemplation of her face, her dress, her one or two ornaments, her dark forehead, her clustered and shining curls and beaming dark eyes. She proceeded to address Helen Burns. "How are you tonight, Helen? Have you coughed much today?" "Not quite so much, I think, ma'am." "And the pain in your chest?" "It is a little better." Miss Mandeer got up, took her hand and examined her pulse. Then she returned to her own seat. As she resumed it, I heard her sigh low. She was pensive a few minutes, then rousing herself, she said cheerfully, "But you two are my visitors tonight. I must treat you as such." She rang her bell. "Bimala," she said to the servant who answered it, "I have not yet had tea. Bring the tray and place cups for these two young ladies." And a tray was soon brought. How pretty to my eyes did the china cups and bright teapot look, placed on the little round table near the fire. How fragrant was the steam of the beverage and the scent of the toast, of which, however, I, to my dismay, for I was beginning to be hungry, discerned only a very small portion. Miss Mandeer discerned it too. "Bimala," said she, "can you not bring a little more bread and butter? There is not enough for 3. Bimala went out. She returned soon. "Madam, Mrs. Harden says she has sent up the usual quantity." Mrs. Harden, be it observed, was the housekeeper, a woman after Mr. Brocklehurst's own heart, made up of equal parts of whalebone and iron. "Oh, very well," returned Miss Mandeer. "We must make it do, Bimala, I suppose." And as the girl withdrew, she added, smiling, "Fortunately, I have it in my power to supply deficiencies for this once." Having invited Helen and me to approach the table, and placed before each of us a cup of tea with one delicious but thin morsel of toast, she got up, unlocked a drawer, and taking from it a parcel wrapped in paper, disclosed presently to our eyes a good-sized seed cake. "I meant to give each of you some of this to take with you," said she, "but as there is so little toast, you must have it now." And she proceeded to cut slices with a generous hand. We feasted that evening as on nectar and ambrosia, and not the least delight of the entertainment was the smile of gratification with which our hostess regarded us, as we satisfied our famished appetites on the delicate fare she liberally supplied. Tea over, and the tray removed, she again summoned us to the fire. We sat one on each side of her, and now a conversation followed between her and Helen, which it was indeed a privilege to be admitted to hear. Miss Mandeer had always something of serenity in her air, of state in her mien, of refined propriety in her language, which precluded deviation into the ardent, the excited, the eager, something which chastened the pleasure of those who looked on her and listened to her, by a controlling sense of awe, and such was my feeling now. But as to Helen Burns, I was struck with wonder. The refreshing meal, the brilliant fire, the presence and kindness of her beloved instructress, or perhaps more than all these, something in her own unique mind had roused her powers within her. They woke, they kindled, First they glowed in the bright tint of her cheek, which till this hour I had never seen but pale and bloodless. Then they shone in the liquid lustre of her eyes, which had suddenly acquired a beauty more singular than that of Miss Mandeer's, a beauty neither of fine colour nor long eyelash, nor pencilled brow, but of meaning, of movement, of radiance. Then her soul sat on her lips, and language flowed, from what source I cannot tell. Has a girl of 14 a heart large enough, vigorous enough to hold the swelling spring of pure, full, fervid eloquence? Such was the characteristic of Helen's discourse on that, to me, memorable evening. Her spirit seemed hastening to live within a very brief span, as much as many live during a protracted existence. They conversed of things I had never heard of nations and times past, of countries far away, of secrets of nature discovered or guessed at. They spoke of books, how many they had read, what stores of knowledge they possessed. They then seemed so familiar with French names and French authors, but my amazement reached its climax when Miss Mandeer asked Helen if she sometimes snatched a moment to recall the Latin her father had taught her, and taking a book from a shelf, bade her read and construe a page of Virgil. And Helen obeyed, my organ of veneration expanding at every sounding line. She had scarcely finished ere the bell announced bedtime. No delay could be admitted. Miss Mandeer embraced us both, saying, as she drew us to her heart, "God's bless you, my children." Helen she held a little longer than me. She let her go more reluctantly. It was Helen her eye followed to the door. It was for her she a second time breathed a sad sigh. For her she wiped a tear from her cheek. On reaching the bedroom, we heard the voice of Miss Scatcherd. She was examining drawers. She had just pulled out Helen Burns, and when we entered, Helen was greeted with a sharp reprimand, and told that tomorrow she should have 6 of untidily folded articles pinned to her shoulder. "My things were indeed in shameful disorder," murmured Helen to me in a low voice. "I intended to have arranged them, but I forgot." Next morning, Miss Scatcherd wrote in conspicuous characters on a piece of pasteboard the word slattern, and bound it round Helen's intelligent and benign-looking forehead. She wore it till evening, patient, unresentful, regarding it as a deserved punishment. The moment Miss Scatcherd withdrew after afternoon school, I ran to Helen, tore it off, and thrust it into the fire. The fury of which she was incapable had been burning in my soul all day, and tears hot and large had continually been scalding my cheek, for the spectacle of her sad resignation gave me an intolerable pain at the heart. About a week subsequently to the incidents above narrated, Miss Mandeer, who had written to Mr. Lloyd, received his answer. It appeared that what he said went to corroborate my account. Miss Mandeer, having assembled the whole school, announced that inquiry had been made into the charges alleged against Jane Eyre, and that she was most happy to be able to pronounce her completely cleared from every imputation. The teachers then shook hands with me and kissed me, and a murmur of pleasure ran through the ranks of my companions. Thus relieved of a grievous load, I from that hour set to work afresh, resolved to pioneer my way through every difficulty. I toiled hard, and my success was proportionate to my efforts. My memory, not naturally tenacious, improved with practice. Exercise sharpened my wits. In a few weeks I was promoted to a higher class. In less than 2 months I was allowed to commence French, Hindi, and horology. I learned the first 2 tenses of the verb être, and assembled my first watch, which did tick, but kept no earthly time, on the same day. That night, on going to bed, I forgot to prepare in imagination the Barmecide supper of hot roast potatoes or white bread and new milk with which I was wont to amuse my inward cravings. I feasted instead on the spectacle of ideal clocks, with a multitude of complications which I saw in the dark, all the work of my own hands, freely swinging planets, minute silver leaves that fall from mechanical trees to mark the hours, faces made out of tiny aspects whose eyes open and close, tiny mechanical cats with swishing tails and green gem eyes. I examined too, in thought, the possibility of my ever being able to translate currently a certain little French story which Madame Pirot had that day shown me. Nor was that problem solved to my satisfaction ere I fell sweetly asleep. Well has Solomon said, "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is, than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." I would not now have exchanged Lowood with all its privations for Gateshead and its daily luxuries.
Thank you for listening to these chapters of Public Works Steampunk presents Jane Eyre. This book is copyright 2021 by R.A. Harding. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and subscribe so you will be notified when the next chapters are available. The Music Box intro and outro was recorded by Nicholas Drewski. If you would like to read the author's notes on this chapter or order the book, please go to publicworkssteampunk.com, and while you're there, join the mailing list to get a one-of-a-kind infographic about the book and more. Farewell for the present.